We have looked into a lot of bizarre missing persons cases on this channel, but this one may actually be downright inexplicable. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. On November 16, 1982, Carbon County, Wyoming deputy Larry Szabo came across an unusual scene while out on patrol along Interstate 80. At the end of an off-ramp leading down to the Wagonhound Rest Area, a car sat still in the intersection, with the driver's side door open and what appeared to be clothes strewn about on the ground. As he approached, he could see that there was nobody in the vehicle, which was parked but still running, and the only sign that anyone had even been there, aside from, the car itself, was a solitary trail of footprints leading north into the snow-covered prairie. Deputy Szabo called the strange situation in, and it wasn't long before more deputies arrived on scene to assist in the search for the car's missing owner, but it didn't take long for things to go from odd to bizarre. You see, following the tracks both on the ground and from the sky, searchers eventually made their way to a barn 4 miles from the idle car. Inside was a pile of sticks arranged as though to start a campfire, as well as a few socks, presumably belonging to the missing driver, who by that point they had identified as Donald Kemp, a 35-year-old former advertising executive out of Maryland. Unfortunately, there was nothing else to be found there, nor were there any tracks leading away from the building. That only made it more confusing when searchers called in to tell the sheriff that they had found a bag of clothes in a haystack on a ranch property some 10 miles away from the abandoned vehicle. Sure enough, the bag was Don's, but why was it there? And more importantly, where was Don? It was a question that would go unanswered for nearly 3 years until a group of deer hunters from Michigan happened to cross paths with the missing man, or at least what was left of him. They were passing through the Willow Spring area, some 4 to 6 miles north of Wagonhound Rest Area, when they found the skeletal remains of what appeared to be a man, and with them a social security card and driver's license, both bearing the name Paul Donald Kemp Jr. But rather than open an investigation into how Don's remains were discovered in an area that had already been searched by people who weren't even looking for him, the sheriff simply closed the case, stating that there was no sign of foul play, and that Kemp must have died of exposure, almost certainly within days of his disappearance. But not everybody agreed with that. You see, Sheriff C.W. Ogburn came out with that conclusion really quickly, as in before the body had even positively medically been identified as the remains of Donald Kemp. And that wasn't the only issue either. 2 years later, in its debut episode, the show Unsolved Mysteries covered the disappearance, and for the first time, a national audience learned of all the bizarre details involved in Don's case. It wasn't just that there was no explanation for why he'd left the car, or that there were no tracks leading from the barn to the ranch, or even that the sheriff closed the case before the body was identified. No, there was much, much more to this story. Friends reported receiving phone calls from Don long after he should have been dead, bartenders recalled serving him months after he was last seen, and a potential witness disappeared into the wind almost as soon as he could be located. If you go by the version presented on Unsolved Mysteries, then the story of Donald Kemp seems at first like so many others that we've seen. A young man goes missing, an apathetic law enforcement apparatus kind of phones in an investigation, and by the time anyone figures out what might have happened, it's too late to do anything about it. This is not one of those cases, though. At least, not entirely. It's true that the sheriff didn't take much interest in the case, even when bizarre clues began to show up, and it's true that there are a lot of unanswered questions. That said, there's something that's left out of the common narrative, and it's the kind of thing which very well could play a role into how he ended up going missing, and maybe even how he died. But while we're on the topic of, things that can kill you, did you know that certain bad habits can do that too? That's right, it's time for the ad segment. And today's sponsor is the ever-familiar, longtime Lore Lodge supporting company, Fume. Fume is a product with a simple mission: help you quit your bad habits by taking the bad out of the habit. This simple device is made out of wood and steel and uses nothing but your breath to pull clean air through this little hole and over a stick of naturally scented fiber, mimicking the experience of your bad habits without any smoke or vapor. The idea is that when you're tempted to reach for something with a filter or a filament, you'll reach for your Fume instead, and over time, you'll stop having all of those cravings altogether. The best part is that Fume is non-habit forming, so once that bad habit is kicked, it's kicked for good. It's also a fidget toy, so there's that too. Over 700,000 people have already made the switch to Fume as part of their habit change journey. So if you're ready to try it for yourself, now is the time. And if you order the Journey Pack using code LORELODGE, you'll get a free fume topper with it, which is a little silicone thing in case you prefer that kind of mouthfeel, and it also protects the steel. If that interests you, you can click the link in our description, head to tryfume.com/lorelodge, or scan the code on the screen to get yours today. When Paul Donald Kemp Jr. graduated from Woodlawn High School in Baltimore County, Maryland, he did so as the class president, and the student voted most likely to succeed by the class of 1965. And as far as his first decade in the adult world went, that was proving to be an accurate assessment. He earned great marks at Lehigh University here in Pennsylvania, where he rose through the ranks to lead his fraternity and spent time working for the school's radio station. That winning streak continued as he made his way into the busy world of New York's advertising scene in the early 1970s, and by the time he was approaching his 30s, Don Kemp looked to be on his way to the top of the industry. But sadly, it wasn't to last. In 1976, Don's career faced a major setback when he was injured in a car accident while riding in a taxi. The crash left him with debilitating back pain and severe whiplash, and ultimately it took 2 years for him to recover enough to go back to work. And once he did, things just weren't the same. While it's likely that Don was facing issues getting back into the groove of a very fast-paced field, it seems like the real challenge was actually the kind of work, and not the high-intensity environment that came with it. And boy, can I relate to that. See, Don wasn't in advertising because graphic design was his passion. He was in advertising because it was a lucrative field with an astronomically high ceiling. His passion, on the other hand, was history. Since he was a small child, Don had always been interested in the past, and in particular, he was fascinated with Abraham Lincoln. When the accident forced him to spend months in bed and then years limiting his activity, he dove back into his historical interests. And as I can personally attest, it's hard to imagine going back into the world of marketing after spending years dedicating yourself to studying something that you're sincerely passionate about. It seems that Don felt the same way, because after just 2 years back in New York, he decided to leave it all behind, at least for a time, so he could chase his dream of writing a history book about his favorite US president and the plot which led to his assassination. According to Don's mother, Mary Kemp, her son planned to head out west, first by following the Lincoln Heritage Trail through Kentucky, Missouri, and Kansas, before striking out for Jackson Hole, Wyoming, to get to work on the writing part. And that bit is a little confusing, since the Lincoln Heritage Trail doesn't pass through Missouri and Kansas, but rather Indiana and Illinois. Moreover, the same papers reported that the last time that Mrs. Kemp heard from her son was on November 12th when he was in North Platte, Nebraska. Now, we've driven out that way ourselves, and to be honest, I can't really think of a good way to travel through both Missouri and Kansas on the way to Wyoming while also making a stop in North Platte. It just doesn't really make sense on a map. So why mention Missouri and Kansas? We can probably just chalk it up to journalistic error. And to be honest, it's not particularly relevant to where he ended up. That said, if I had to reconstruct his route, I'd probably say he made his way to DC and then I-64, or he went to Baltimore, then took I-70 to I-68 and I-68 to I-79, got off on I-64 near Charleston, West Virginia, and then stayed on 64 until he hit Lexington. From there, he probably drove state roads to Hodgenville and then Hawesville, hitting various stops along the way until he crossed into Indiana at Cannelton. Then it would have been more state roads taking him back to I-64 and then west across the state until he crossed into Illinois north of New Harmony. He probably stayed on 64 until he hit Mount Vernon, where he likely turned north onto Illinois Route 37, and from there made his way along various highways until he reached Lincoln, Illinois. There's only really 2 ways west from there, which means he either went south to I-72 or north to I-74. The latter would be the more direct route to I-80 and therefore North Platte, so I think that's probably the way he went, and likely with a stop in Lincoln, Nebraska along the way. Speaking of Lincoln, if you're ever there, make time to check out a little speakeasy called The Other Room, and if you do, tell them we sent you, because you might get something special out of it. Whatever the case, heading west from North Platte would have spit Don into Wyoming at Pine Bluffs, and then on to his next known stop in Cheyenne. Now, if you've never been to Cheyenne, from my experience, there's honestly not much to see. Don't get me wrong, it's a very nice little prairie city of about 65,000 people, but it's not the kind of place where there's a lot to do. Granted, we were there on a Sunday afternoon right after Cheyenne Frontier Days came to a close, so we may have just been there at a bad time, but from what the locals told us, it's usually pretty quiet outside of that 1 week a year. For a historian, however, there's at least one reason to spend an afternoon in town, and that's the Old West Museum. There's not much information out there about his time spent at the museum, but we do know that Kemp spent a couple of hours roaming around, and then he called a friend in New York. And that is the last anyone ever heard from Donald Kemp. Or at least it's the last time anyone can confirm they heard from him, but we'll get to that later. The next day, Deputy Szabo would find Kemp's car idling in an intersection near a middle-of-nowhere rest stop off I-80, kicking off one of the strangest missing persons cases in the history of not just the state of Wyoming, but in my personal opinion, the entire United States. Deputy Larry Szabo must have been confused. Anyone should be confused in his situation. Here he was on a cool Tuesday morning, standing on an off-ramp, looking at a parked, running Chevrolet Blazer, radio still on with half a tank of gas, packed to the windows with clothes, food, and all sorts of other belongings, and no owner in sight. More clothes spilled out the side of the open driver's side door, and the only sign of the driver himself was a trail of solitary footprints leading north into the snow-crusted prairie. Understandably perplexed by the situation, Szabo called into headquarters at about 11 a.m., and the search for Don Kemp began. If you've seen the Unsolved Mysteries episode on this story, then you might be wondering why I'm referring to the responding officer as Deputy Szabo, which is fair since the TV show cited a man named Randy Teeters. And though the show does say he's the one who found the car, none of the papers mention Teeters, nor does the show quote him as saying that he was the first officer on the scene. Although I have seen a number of comments confirming that Randy Teeters was a real person. Personally, I think this is probably just Unsolved Mysteries' way of simplifying the story for the audience, since Teeters is the one who agreed to be interviewed, while Szabo doesn't appear in the episode. Either way, Teeters does appear to have been involved in the search, whether he was in the car with Szabo when he stumbled across the scene or not. Now, the initial effort was small, but that's not necessarily a sign the police didn't care. Nobody had been reported missing, and with 20,000 residents spread across 8,000 square miles, Carbon County didn't have all that many deputies to spare. What they did have was 5 deputies in an airplane, and while Szabo, Teeters, and 2 other officers followed the tracks out into the wilderness, Deputy Rod Johnson took to the skies to scan the prairie from above. It's hard to say how snowy the area was, as weather data from the time is hard to come by, but going by the limited information coming from Cheyenne, it can't have been all that much. That said, it must have been deep enough for them to follow the driver's prints some 4 miles north until they came to a barn, which presented them with yet another confusing scene. According to the Baltimore Sun, the searchers found an orange teapot along the way, and then 3 of Kemp's socks inside of the abandoned building. Unsolved Mysteries doesn't mention the teapot, but they do note the presence of what looked to be an unlit campfire. Stranger still, there were no tracks leading away from the barn, either on the way back they'd come, or going off in any other direction. It may be that there just wasn't enough snow to leave anything behind, but they'd managed to follow him that far, so it's hard to say for sure. Whatever the case, it appeared he must have left the barn at some point, since he certainly didn't seem to be there anymore, but if he had left, then where did he go? Perhaps more importantly, why was he out there in the first place? That was a question to which the police had no answer, and this is where the problems with the investigation begin to look less like issues with capacity and more like deliberate apathy. When the Carbon County authorities failed to locate Don Kemp on that first day, they had options available to them. They could have called up the local population, small as it was, to form search parties and cover more ground, but instead they simply informed ranchers to be on the lookout. They could have reached out to the state for more resources, or potentially even the FBI, given that the car was found on a federal highway, but for some reason, they didn't even reach out to neighboring counties or to any of the local search and rescue groups. Instead, Sheriff C.W. Ogburn actually reduced the number of deputies assigned to the search on its second day, and then suspended the search altogether on the third. In fact, the search hadn't even been active for 72 hours yet when the sheriff shut it down, citing blizzard conditions which made further efforts impossible until the weather eased up. Then, once the storm had passed, he refused to revisit the search, citing the belief that nobody could have survived the elements for that long without finding shelter. Not only that, but going back over the papers, I began to pick up on some behavior that, in hindsight, looks very odd. When they first learned that Don was missing, the Kemp family had posted a $1,000 reward for information leading to his recovery, only for Ogburn to ask that they withdraw the reward a day later. That's a little odd, though there are some rational explanations, like keeping the lines clear and avoiding false leads, but it's not the only thing that seems to be off. See, I couldn't find any reporting on the search until November 19th, and based on that article in the Casper Star Tribune, The information came either from the morning of that date or from the day prior, because the article refers to the search as being ongoing. The interesting part is that the 19th was the third and final day of searches, and yet the sheriff never once mentioned the socks and the teapot found by following the tracks out to the barn. In fact, the Casper Star-Tribune quoted him as saying, "We found his vehicle abandoned close to Wagonhound, and all of his belongings were there," and even went so far as to tell the press that footprints were found in the area, but it wasn't known if Kemp had made them. He also reportedly told the press that "We've been at this for 2.5 days, and we still haven't come up with anything." It wouldn't be until December 1st that the public learned of the socks found in the barn, or of the bag of clothes a rancher discovered in a haystack 10 miles from the car. So why didn't Ogburn mention any of that? One possibility is that the papers weren't clear enough in their wording. The same December 1st article in the Star-Tribune does say, "As many as 40 people at one time have searched for Kemp on horseback, in vehicles, on foot, and in the air," just before noting the discovery of the clothes. Their article on the 9th is equally vague, simply saying that searchers found the items in the barn and that a rancher found the clothes in the haystack. So maybe it wasn't the deputies who found the items, but rather the volunteers who came out after the blizzard? The major wrench in that explanation is that Unsolved Mysteries, whose crew interviewed multiple people involved with the search, reports that Deputy Rod Johnson and 2 other deputies were the ones who found a duffel bag lying near the single set of footprints. Unfortunately, that actually answers fewer questions than it creates, because they also said that the duffel bag contained soap, clothes, and a teapot, while reporting from the Baltimore Sun in 1983 has the teapot being found alongside the footprints on the way to the barn, the socks being found in the barn, and the rest of the items turning up in the haystack, which again was 5 miles from the barn. But if the teapot and the barn were both found by following the prints, then they must have been found within the first 2 days, before the blizzard. And then again, none of the papers explicitly say that anything was found by deputies. The Baltimore Sun gets the closest, but even then the exact wording is "a single set of footprints in the light snow strode north into the prairie. They found his orange teapot along the way, and 4 miles further, 3 socks in an abandoned barn." So again, is that poor wording, or is it deliberately vague wording meant to invoke a sense of mystery? It's genuinely difficult to say. On the one hand, we could be looking at a sheriff who inexplicably lied about what they'd turned up in the first couple of days of the search, tried to keep the situation quiet by getting the family to drop the reward, and then shut down the investigation before anyone else could get wind. But on the other, it could be that the deputies didn't actually find anything before the blizzard, the department didn't want to deal with monitoring a tip line, and the sheriff didn't feel like devoting resources to finding a missing tourist who appeared to have walked off into the wilderness of his own volition. Whatever the reality was, the fact of the matter is that the sheriff did make a strange decision in choosing not to reach out to available resources. And that wasn't just the opinion of the Kemp family either, who for their part had been quick to reintroduce the reward, and at double the previous offering of $1,000. In August of 1983, Deputy Szabo told Baltimore Sun correspondent Doug Struck that he felt as though more could have been done, particularly on the second day. What he meant was that by that point, they should have been calling around for help. Willis Larson, who was a former sheriff and at the time a civil defense official based in Cheyenne, told Struck that he'd actually reached out to Ogburn to offer assistance at the state level, including trained search experts, more planes, and manpower, but was rebuffed. Larson felt strongly that the sheriff's department didn't know what they were doing and told Struck that his people could have determined to a very, very small percentage whether he was in the area or they could have found him. So when Ogburn told Struck, "We did everything humanly possible to locate Mr. Kemp," he wasn't being entirely truthful. Or maybe in his mind he was. As it turns out, this kind of behavior wasn't out of character for Ogburn, who told Struck that if you invite those people in, then you spend half your time looking for them. You don't need a whole bunch of people wandering around the desert. And according to William Reiling, another defense official, Ogburn was one of the old guard who doesn't want outsiders in. In a way, that could be seen as faith in his own men. According to the sheriff, Deputy Johnson knew every sagebrush out there, and if he said Kemp wasn't out there, then he wasn't out there. Johnson seems to have agreed, having told the paper that he couldn't be out there that I wouldn't find him. As far as both Ogburn and Johnson were concerned, Kemp simply wasn't in the area and had left of his own accord. Johnson reportedly even said he walked out of there, while Ogburn expressed the opinion that Don had framed the whole thing in a deliberate attempt to disappear. Without a body, there was no one who could tell him he was wrong. To be fair, there was a reason for the sheriff to think that Don wasn't in the area anymore, beyond the lack of any remains. Though that reason came so late in the case that it really doesn't excuse the decision not to ask for help. The lead came from Judy Aiello, a friend and business associate of Don's back in New York. In April of 1983, Judy came home after being away for several months, and when she went to check her voicemail, she unwittingly stumbled into the investigation. As it turns out, she'd been away so long that she wasn't even aware Don was missing. But she was still a little puzzled when she heard his voice leaving a message asking her to call him back at a number she didn't recognize. The message hadn't been complicated. She'd later tell the papers that it was something along the lines of, "I would like to speak with you again, call me at ... and then the number. Oddly, the caller hadn't given his name, but he had called her on her unlisted home phone number, so between that and the fact that she had known Don for 10 years, she was sure that it was his voice on the other end. That only made it more confusing when she dialed the number he'd left, only to have someone who certainly wasn't Don pick up. She asked the stranger if Don was there, and at first he responded yes, only to quickly follow up by saying no, and not in the sense that people from our neck of the woods say yeah, no, or no, yeah, giving you an answer that really can only be determined based on context. No, this was him saying yeah and then realizing he wasn't supposed to say that. Anyway, not yet aware that her friend was a missing person, she asked, "Well, could you give him a message saying that I returned his call?" To which the man replied, "Fine," before hanging up, implying that he knew who she was talking about. The whole thing didn't sit very well with Judy, who went to Mary Kemp with the odd story, and Mary jumped on the lead, somehow tracing the call to a trailer in Casper, Wyoming, about 136 miles away from Wagonhound Rest Area by the shortest route. She immediately informed Casper authorities, who wasted no time driving out to speak with the registered tenant of the trailer, a young man named Mark Dennis. At first, Dennis was very cooperative with the Natrona County Sheriff's Department, but it didn't take long for talks to go south. He denied having any knowledge of who Donald Kemp was or where he'd been, even though he had told Judy Aiello that he would give Don a message, and suggested that someone else may have made the call from his phone, then even agreed to take a polygraph test. What he wouldn't do, though, was talk to Mary Kemp, who called him in a desperate attempt to learn what he might know about her son. But all Dennis told her was that he knew nothing about Donald Kemp, again, even though he had told Judy Aiello that he would give Don Kemp a message for her, and he just paid those phone bills, he didn't look at them. And that part's probably true. I do wonder if that implies that he was saying that there was somebody else who used the phone, and that he wasn't the one using it, but that's neither here nor there, or is it? Anyway, after that, he hired an attorney, withdrew the offer to take a polygraph test, and moved 300 miles away to Evanston, all the way on the other side of the state, and just a few short miles from the Utah border. The problem was that after he voluntarily turned over his phone records, police learned that there hadn't been just one call from his property to Judy Aiello's unlisted number. There had been 5. This left the police in an interesting yet frustrating position. 2 of the calls were made on February 27, 1983, 2 were on April 5th, and then there was 1 more on April 10th. That is 3 separate occasions on which someone other than Mark must have been in his trailer, and that someone had to know Judy's unlisted home phone number. One time could be a break-in, but 3 separate dates across 2 months, that doesn't really add up. And it also wasn't the only lead coming out of Casper. In May of 1983, Mary Kemp traveled out there herself, hoping to confront Dennis, but if he was still there, he wasn't answering his door. That didn't stop her from going around town with a picture of her son, however, and that netted a couple more clues which suggested Don might have been there at some point, at least according to Unsolved Mysteries. If their version of events is to be believed, and remember, there's been a few spots where they got details wrong, then there had been 2 different sightings of Donald Kemp in Casper in the months since he'd vanished. Once at a bar, and again at a traveling Abraham Lincoln exhibit. Unfortunately, there are some problems there. First of all, while there was indeed an Abraham Lincoln exhibit in Casper in 1983, it was in late May, by which point Mark Dennis had already moved to Evanston, and possibly also while Mary Kemp was still in town looking for her son. If he was still out and about, it's hard to believe that he would have been unaware that he was considered a missing person. The other problem is that Mark Dennis bore a striking resemblance to Don Kemp, despite being 5 years younger, so it was possible that the bartender who remembered serving him had actually served Mark, and misidentified the 2 men when asked about it months later. Still, it would have been worthwhile for police to follow up on the possibility that these were legitimate sightings, and yet it doesn't seem that they ever did, nor does it seem that they kept much of an eye on Mark Dennis. In fact, it seems like they never even really considered looking deeper into Mark Dennis at all, considering that in 1987, Sheriff's Captain Mark Benton told Unsolved Mysteries that "I have no reason to feel that the individual here in Casper had any knowledge of this man even being in Wyoming, other than these phone calls," which, were from his trailer, so that's just an absurd statement no matter how you frame it. The only person in Wyoming who could possibly have had access to Judy's home phone number was Don Kemp, and yet in spite of the fact that Dennis was never able to offer an explanation for how those phone calls were made from his residence, Wyoming authorities never opened any serious investigation. Instead, Benton told the Baltimore Sun that the calls were a substantial lead, which could lead to the speculation that Paul Donald Kemp designed his own disappearance. And that was the prevailing theory by the time 1984 rolled around. Donald Kemp had staged his disappearance for some reason or another, and there was no sense in looking for a man who didn't want to be found. The evidence was everywhere. Motel records from the weeks leading up to his disappearance showed that he'd been watching movies in which people go missing, like Body Heat and Sharky's Machine on cable. It couldn't be that they were thriller movies starring some of the bigger actors of the day. He'd apparently called an old college friend sobbing about something. There was no way that wasn't connected. There's also the fact that during the search, he'd never once tried to wave down the plane, and it was impossible that Deputy Johnson had just missed him, or that, Don didn't realize people were looking for him. Just because you see a plane in the sky doesn't mean you know it's a search plane. And, never mind the discarded clothing or the food left behind in his blazer. Pay no heed to the clues suggesting he left the van in a hurry. And above all else, do not question how those phone calls were made. Donald Kemp, a man on his way west with a plan to follow his dreams, had staged his own disappearance. And that was the story the police were going to be sticking with. And that probably would have been the end of it too, if not for a few deer hunters. There's almost no details about how exactly it happened, but on October 8th, 1985, the Associated Press reported that, according to Sheriff C.W. Ogburn, the skeletal remains of Donald Kemp were found by a group of Michigan hunters late on Friday, October 4th. Now, that's a very interesting way of presenting the information for one subtle reason. Usually, when human remains are found in an area where someone went missing, law enforcement will say something to the effect of, "We found human remains that we believe may belong to so-and-so." And this is usually because they want to go and make sure that these are the remains. Either have family say, yeah, that's him, or do something forensic like, dental records if the body is too decomposed to tell. In this case, however, the sheriff left no room for debate about the topic. Despite the fact the body had yet to be positively identified, and that the most an autopsy of skeletal remains can really do is rule things out, Sheriff Ogburn was sure that Donald Kemp had left his car of his own free will, walked into the Wyoming prairie, and died of exposure on that first night. Clearly, he'd been right all along. Except for all the many, many ways in which he wasn't. You see, the papers reporting on the discovery of Donald Kemp's remains get the location wrong. They identify it as Willow Springs Draw, which would be possible if not for the fact that they also report it as being near where he went missing. Willow Springs Draw is over 100 miles from where Don left his car, but the similarly named Willow Spring, once a popular stop along the Oregon Trail, is just about 5 or 6 miles to the north of the car. And that's important because, if you'll recall, Sheriff Ogburn and Deputy Johnson were absolutely positive that Donald Kemp was not in the search area by the time they were finished looking. Now, here he was, not just in the search area, but out in the open, in the direction of the footprints Deputy Szabo followed from his car, directly between where the car was found and a ranch which fits the description of where his laundry bag turned up, down to the milepost. This was an area which had been searched numerous times, both before and after the blizzard, by both law enforcement and volunteers, and it was not far from the barn where the socks were found either. There is a lot about that just doesn't make sense, and even more so if you're looking to say that Donald Kemp left his car willingly, walked off into the wilderness, and died of exposure. Beginning with why he would have done that in the first place. For that part, though, the sheriff was sure he had an answer. According to Sheriff Ogburn, the whole thing about writing a book was just a cover story for what Kemp was actually planning to do in Wyoming. Start a cult. Accusing a dead missing person of disappearing because he was trying to start a cult is a pretty bold move, but Sheriff Ogburn believed he had the evidence to prove it. Speaking to the Associated Press, he said that Kemp had told friends of gathering the masses and starting a cult. Not only that, but he told one person he was going to be a prophet and a leader of men. That person, it would seem, was Paulette Harari, a friend of Kemp's who said that she'd met him about 8 months before he left for Wyoming, and recalled that Don had mentioned something about going to be in the center of an empty space with no civilization in sight, but there would be mountains around, and it would be there that he gathered the masses. The testimony of one lone named individual wasn't all he had, though. According to Doug Struck, Don told friends he was quitting to write a book about Lincoln, spiritualism, and what he told some was the truth. What was the truth? Nobody knows for sure, but he'd apparently told his mother that it was an assassination theory, though others, who are unnamed, said he'd confided in them that it would expose secret powers controlling the world. He'd also allegedly recorded a diary on tape in which he said, "I have the truth will come through me, and I am attuned to a higher spiritual plane. I am a messenger of God." This, coupled with the sobbing phone call, the movies that Mattel's, and a progressively sloppier diary that proclaimed him in its final entry as an emancipator of men, was more than enough to convince Ogburn that Donald Kemp had gone absolutely insane, and that there was no reason whatsoever to suspect foul play in his disappearance. The diary itself is a very interesting addition to the story, mainly because where it was found and what it could imply. You see, so far as I can tell, they didn't find that in the Chevy, but rather at the museum in Cheyenne. Apparently, Kemp had left an attaché case behind when he left the museum the day prior, and inside, investigators found both his notes for the book as well as the diary. But nobody has ever shared the details of what else he'd written, or if anything else of importance was there beside what was reported in the papers. This leaves a few questions, including why have I only ever seen the words attaché case written 3 times, and why are they always in weird circumstances? But I'd argue that the most important are, could this case have contained Judy's number, and how could Don leave such an important case behind without noticing? But there's also another question, which is more related to Don's mental state. And that's, when did the sloppiness in the diary start? I ask because it would appear that back in March of 1982, just 8 months before Don went missing, he wrote a letter to the editor of the Easton, Maryland-based Star-Democrat, entitled A Tribute to Aunt Elsie. I won't read it in full, but what I will tell you is that this is not the writing of a madman. It is completely coherent, it is well written, and reflective of times gone by. Appropriate, given the occasion for which Don wrote the letter was Elsie's 100th birthday. Sure, it does mention religion, but not in any way that should ring alarm bells. The most direct reference to spirituality comes with a line reading, "If life is a precious gift from God, then Aunt Elsie must be very special in his eyes, for he has given her more of that gift than probably anyone else we will ever know." That's not religious fanaticism. That is a perfectly normal, heartfelt way for a Christian to look at things, so it's hard to imagine that within 8 months of writing that, Don had gone so completely insane that he thought he was chosen by God to start a religious movement in the middle of the Wyoming prairie. Another odd aspect of the story is that outside of that one 1983 article in the Baltimore Sun, there's very little mention of Don's supposed fanaticism. His girlfriend back in New York didn't seem to recall him saying anything about a cult, nor did any of his close friends, his mother, or his sister. In fact, they were all pretty sure that anything he was talking about with spirituality was nothing more than pipe smoke philosophy, that Don wasn't seriously saying he was a prophet, but rather he thought he was onto something that had to do with the Lincoln assassination and perhaps a new look into how it might have happened. Additionally, Mary Kemp was adamant that she hadn't noticed any changes in her son's behavior over the months leading up to his trip, and that he was in constant contact with her either through postcards or phone calls right up until a few days before he went missing. The only thing she could recall, which sounded strange, was the way he signed off the last time they talked. According to her, he said, "Mom, I really love you." On the one hand, it does make sense that a mother wouldn't want to consider the possibility that her son had gone off the rails and then run off into the wilderness to his death. But on the other, it's a little difficult to accept that she wouldn't have noticed anything at all was wrong, especially if he was telling women he'd met only a few months earlier, like Paulette Harari, that he was planning to start a cult. I mean, again, his girlfriend didn't know about that, Judy didn't know about that, his sister didn't know about that, and his mother didn't know about that, but somehow this one woman did? This one woman and absolutely nobody else? Moreover, we're told that there were so many materials found to suggest he was going off the deep end. Yet, all that anyone arguing for that could produce were a few vague quotes from his diaries, stripped of all context. Sure, it's eccentric to say, "I have the truth, and the truth will come through me," but considering the man was working on a book about the conspiracy to kill Lincoln, not exactly a ridiculous statement to make. Even if all of that was enough to explain why Don pulled his car off the highway, jumped out with nothing but a laundry bag, a teapot, and some clothes, and then ran off into the wilderness, it doesn't explain how nobody found his plainly visible body for 3 years. Or, more importantly, who called Judy from that trailer in Casper months after Don was supposed to be dead. And the issue with that one isn't even that Judy was sure it was Don's voice. It's that her phone number was unlisted. Today, that's not a big deal. You can find just about anything online. But in the 1980s, that was a pretty insurmountable obstacle to finding someone's home phone number. What is the likelihood that someone in Wyoming, other than Donald Kemp, knew her phone number, sounded like him, and also called her 5 times from the same location? It's not high, I'll tell you that much, but then again, what's the alternative? It would be easy to say there was some kind of conspiracy at play here and that the sheriff's department had something to do with the disappearance, but I don't think that's the simplest explanation. To me, it seems far more likely that Sheriff Ogburn was generally apathetic about searching for a guy with New York plates, and that both he and Deputy Johnson were overconfident in their skills as law enforcement officers. I mean, these are guys from small towns in Wyoming, and it wouldn't be shocking if they were averse to the idea of people from the East Coast coming in and telling them how they were doing everything wrong. No, if something nefarious happened, I think it's more likely that it had to do with Don pissing off some locals than anything else. If it were the locals, though, how did he end up in Casper? And if he was never in Casper, then how did someone there end up with Judy's phone number? Beyond that, was there really nobody Mark Dennis could recall being in his home at the time when the calls were placed to Judy? How was it that police saw no reason to suspect that Mark Dennis knew anything, even though he couldn't give them anything at all to explain where those calls came from? If I were the sheriff of Natrona County and you handed me phone records which showed someone had placed 5 calls to an unlisted number of a friend of a missing person from the same location on 3 separate occasions, and then told me that the person to whom that phone was registered insisted they didn't make the calls, but also couldn't explain why they came from his home, the alarm bells would ring so loud you'd hear them in Bozeman. Yet somehow none of that struck anyone as odd. Then there's the fact that when the remains finally did turn up, they weren't just in a place people had already searched multiple times, but also somehow smack in the middle between the missing person's car and the spot where people found more of his belongings. I mean, how do we explain this one? Did Donald Kemp jump out of his car, carry his laundry bag 10 miles north, drop it in a haystack, then walk halfway back to the car, set up a fire but not light it, leave behind some socks, and then go to die of exposure in the brush outside? Even with full consideration of the potential mental health problems at play, that makes absolutely 0 sense. And that's really the crux of this entire case. When all evidence is accounted for, no explanation seems to account for every aspect. If Don Kemp left his car and ran out into the prairie, dying of exposure later that day, why didn't anyone find him during the initial search? Why were his clothes found 5 miles further away than his body? Why didn't he seek shelter when he reached the ranch? Who called Judy Aiello in the first months of 1983? The only way all of that works is if he didn't die of exposure, but how could he have survived? How could he have made his way to a town over 100 miles away with no food, winter clothes, or survival gear? It seems that the only way to account for all the details is to say that he must have been run off the road and abducted, then taken to Casper, but if that were the case, why was there only one set of footprints leading away from the car? And if someone abducted him, took him all the way to Casper, and then the sheriff closed the investigation, why would that person bring the remains back? They got away with it. I mean, sure, stupidity is always a possibility, but if you bury the body somewhere in Natrona County, chances are nobody is ever going to connect that to the missing person in Carbon County. And if you are going to plant a body, why would you leave identifying materials with it? I mean, I have been trying to come up with an answer that doesn't involve ignoring some key piece of evidence all week, but no matter how hard I try, there's just nothing. I mean, one thing which could explain it is if some of those bones out there weren't his, but even then, so many other questions remain. And as far as the bones being his, I didn't see any information about positive identification ever happening. I have no idea if those were his remains. They probably could dig him up and do DNA testing, but at this point, I mean, what does that solve? Actually, no, if they haven't positively identified the body, they should definitely do that, because then that's somebody's body, and whose body is it? But no, I mean, so many cases we've covered. By the end of it, I'm like, look, this might not be the most likely thing, but this series of events is possible. In this case, I cannot think of a series of events that are possible. Maybe it's just because I've been looking at it too much, and I only had a week. Maybe you guys will watch this video and something will be obvious to you. And if it is, please leave it in the comments, because I'm scratching my head about what could have happened to this guy. I even looked into some other things. I mean, the young pictures of the guy, he looks exactly like Chris Pratt. And, you know, maybe he's Chris Pratt's real dad. But Chris Pratt has a dad, well, had a dad. And I don't think anyone ever doubted that he was the real dad. But yeah, point of the matter is, I genuinely don't know. I have been racking my brain. The one thing I didn't have a chance to really look into was what he might have been considering with Abraham Lincoln. It had to do with a woman named Mary Surratt, who was the first woman to be hanged in the United States. and she owned the boarding house that had something to do with the assassination. I'm not an expert on Lincoln. But now I'm considering, like, I think you guys seem to like the videos where we talk about movies, so maybe I'll do a breakdown of National Treasure 2 and also National Treasure 1. I love National Treasure. I love National Treasure so much. It's my favorite movie. Yeah. By far. Not even, I mean, the only thing that comes close is Return of the King. That's not the point. But yeah, I mean, I look over this case and I just see so many disconnects and so many unanswered questions. It's obvious that the police didn't really put their whole, investigussy into it, but I don't know that there's anything they could have done. The only thing that could possibly uncover this is if they had held Mark Dennis's feet to the fire. I can maybe see a situation where the person who picked up the phone when Judy called the number that somebody had left from that trailer, potentially Don, is that somebody who wasn't Mark picked up, and that Mark had a roommate or a friend or somebody who was involved with some bad stuff. And so maybe that's why Mark said he didn't know anything about Don, is because he wasn't the one who picked up the phone when Judy called, and that he was trying to cover for somebody. Maybe that's why he moved. Maybe he was trying to avoid any further questions that he didn't get linked to a crime. But yeah, like I said, the only way I can answer the phone call question, other than that it was Mark Dennis, is that somebody else was staying in that trailer, and somehow Don Kemp was kept captive there without anybody noticing for at least 5 months. And even then, that doesn't explain why he left the car, how the footprints got there, why his stuff was there, because again, all of that happened in the first few days. So there wasn't really time for somebody to go back and plant that evidence. There are roads out there, but I don't know if they're dirt roads. I don't know if they were there in the 1980s. So yeah, God, the only way this ever gets solved, it's like the Robert Springfield case all over again. The only way this ever gets solved is if people on the ground at the time put in more work than they did. And because we can't do that, it's likely that nobody's ever going to know what happened. So yeah, maybe there's an answer in there, but this one is genuinely baffling to me. I have no clue what happened here. That said, if any of you know anything, if you were related to the guy, if you're from the area, if there's information you have on this case, now that we're doing our podcast as a recorded show, this is something that I can definitely revisit later. I also, in these episodes, if I get to another case that's in Wyoming and I come across information that clarifies this, I'll include an update to this case in another video on Wyoming. So for those of you who've been watching the channel, you've seen me do this before. This is, talked about Riley Strain with Sebastian Rogers. And we talked about Trenny Gibson and Jeff Haig kind of in videos that came out. We correct ourselves whenever we get new information and we find a way to work it in. So if you have information, please do give it to me. Comment about it. And if you want to see the National Treasure video, please do comment National Treasure or something to that extent, because that way I'll know. The movie ones have been risky. They've either done really well or abysmally bad. So National Treasure's great, though. I can't imagine you guys would. But tell me if you want it, okay? Anyway, speaking of things being abysmally bad, one way that you can help us ignore the algorithm entirely is to check us out on Patreon. It's just $1 a month, and if everybody who watches these videos every week were to subscribe to the Patreon at the $1 a month tier, we literally would not have to take ads. Ever. Like, literally never. Not only that, we could go ahead and we could start making movies, we could start doing documentaries, probably launch a few more shows. I know that's not going to happen. My point, though, is that the more of you there are over there, the less we have to care about the algorithm here. But also, as always, if you aren't comfortable with that, if you don't have the money to spare, if it's just not your thing, we have no problem with that. You watching the video here on YouTube is more than enough, and we appreciate that completely. We put these videos up here for you to watch for free. I mean, it's just what we do. And as painful as this site can be at times, it is great to be able to do this kind of work and to be able to bring this stuff to you, because you guys are what make it possible. That said, if you would like to support us in some way other than Patreon, say you want to, feel like you're wearing our skin or drinking in our essence, you can do so by going to Bunker Branding and purchasing our merch, or buying Mount Pocono Perk, it's called, from Tableau Roasting Co. There's a small batch roastery down in Kentucky. I work closely with the owner to design the blend, and I love it. I drink it every day. It's a medium roast that I specifically designed to be, Sophisticated enough to drink black, but mild enough to drink with cream, sugar, French vanilla, whatever you want. It also makes a decent espresso. Not a perfect espresso, but a decent espresso. It's better than Starbucks, I'll tell you that. And of course, if you want to get more Lodge, you can do so by checking out The Weird Bible, History Unhinged, our now recorded format podcast, The Lore Lads. You can also check out my personal channel where I stream video games mostly, or Aiden Thornbury's brand new channel, Silver Retention, which is a film channel where he does deep dives into the making of movies. And I will, at times, also be guesting over there when there's some lore to discuss. You can also catch this show, History Unhinged, our podcast. All of that is on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever. Hit the notification bell, but because it doesn't seem to work, you might want to also follow us on Discord. You can join our Discord by going to bit.ly/jointhelodge or clicking the link in the description. You can find just about everything I've mentioned here in the link in the description. Yeah, that's the best way to get timely notifications. And we also, we play Quiplash with you guys sometimes, or Cards Against Humanity. Various things. It's not on a schedule, we just do it. Last but not least, thank you to Fume for sponsoring yet another of our videos. They have been a massive help to us over the years. And I'm Aiden Madison. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.